Greetings, Insomniacs and aficionados of historical suffering. Tonight we take a terrifying trip to the 1930s. Forget the glamour, this is the Great Depression, where a job was a myth, a meal a miracle, and the American dream a recurring nightmare. Being a worker then was a masterclass in creative desperation. It truly, hilariously, tragically sucked. Your TikTok algorithm is a picnic compared to this. If our dive into economic despair tickles your dark funny bone, give this video a gentle like and subscribe. Now dim the lights, maybe grab a single bruised apple, and let's drift into misery. Let us settle in. Before the universe decided to hit the reset button on the American economy, there was an era of such blissful, determined ignorance that it almost feels like a parody. Welcome to the Roaring Twenties, a decade-long party where the music was loud, the morals were loose, and the stock market was apparently powered by dreams and fairy dust. It was a golden age of forgetting the recent unpleasantness of a world war and embracing a future that seemed not just bright but blindingly, irresponsibly shiny. This glorious new era was built on the novel idea that you could, and absolutely should, own things you couldn't afford. The automobile, the radio, the electric icebox. These weren't just conveniences, they were tickets to a shimmering, modern world. And if you didn't have the cash, that was fine. Credit was the decade's favorite new invention. It allowed ordinary people to live like tomorrow's millionaires, a delightful arrangement that depended entirely on the minor detail of tomorrow actually arriving with a winning lottery ticket. But the real national pastime, the true heart of this fevered dream, was the stock market. It was a magical place where numbers only went up. Barbers, elevator operators, and shoeshine boys eagerly shared stock tips with their millionaire clients, and for a brief, bewildering moment, they were all correct. The market became a siren song for the masses, promising an escape from the drudgery of actual work. Why punch a clock when you could just call a broker and get rich by lunchtime? The secret sauce to this nationwide get-rich-quick scheme was a charming little mechanism called buying on margin. In essence, it meant borrowing money, usually from your broker, to buy more stocks. You could put down a fraction of the cost and borrow the rest. It was like a financial funhouse mirror, making your small savings look enormous. The only catch was that this entire fantasy relied on the market perpetually rising. There was, of course, no plan for what might happen if it decided to go in the other direction. For a while, the delusion held strong, but in the autumn of 1929, the magnificent orchestra that was the American stock market began to sound a few sour notes. A few days of dizzying drops were waved away by the era's financial gurus as mere market corrections. A healthy consolidation, they cooed, reassuring everyone that the party was simply taking a brief intermission. Investors were told to hold their nerve, that prosperity was permanent and the fundamentals were sound. They were, to put it mildly, catastrophically wrong. Then came the crescendo. On October 29, 1929, a day that would be morbidly nicknamed Black Tuesday, the music stopped for good. The opening bell was less a call to trade and more a starting pistol for a stampede. 16 million shares were sold in a single, gut-wrenching day. The ticker tape, the primitive ancestor of our modern news feeds, couldn't keep up with the sheer volume of ruin. It fell hours behind, printing a ghost market that no longer existed while the real one was in free fall. Billions of dollars in wealth evaporated into thin air. The psychological whiplash was instantaneous and brutal. Men who had woken up as paper millionaires found themselves destitute by sunset. The stories became legendary, and not in a good way. One minute, you're a captain of industry picking out a new yacht. The next, you're standing in that same suit on a street corner, trying to sell apples or pencils to make enough for a bowl of soup. The illusion of wealth was revealed to be just that, an illusion. And the withdrawal was agonizing. This wasn't just a bad day on Wall Street. It was the spark that lit the fuse of a decade-long economic bomb. The crash triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. As investors were wiped out, they couldn't repay their loans, causing banks to collapse by the thousands. As the banks failed, they took the life savings of ordinary workers with them. With no money and no credit, factories shut their doors and businesses went under. The Roaring Twenties hangover had officially begun, and it was going to be a long, miserable, and very, very dull decade for the American worker. Now, sleep. As the champagne flutes of the Roaring Twenties were swept away, they were replaced by something far less glamorous, the tin cup. The national hangover from the stock market crash settled in, and with it came a chilling new reality. The vibrant pulse of American industry slowed to a near flat line, and the once guaranteed rhythm of the morning work whistle fell silent. In its place, a new national pastime emerged, a grim spectacle of patience and despair. Welcome, weary traveler, to America's newest and most popular attraction, the unemployment line. The numbers themselves are so large they become absurd, a kind of statistical dark comedy. In 1929, before the great financial pratfall, unemployment was a comfortable, almost charming 3%. By 1933, that number had rocketed to a staggering 25%. 1 in every 4 people in the workforce had no work. In industrial hubs like Cleveland and Toledo, the figures were even more ridiculous, climbing to 50 and even 80%. In Detroit, the city that put America on wheels, the assembly lines that once spat out a new Model A every minute fell silent. The promise of the automobile had become a dead end. For millions, the day began not with the promise of productivity, but with a well-rehearsed ritual of futility. You would wake in the cold, pre-dawn gloom and put on your best clothes. This wasn't vanity, it was a performance. You had to look employable, ready to work, even when the rational part of your brain knew there was no work to be had. A frayed collar, a worn-out pair of shoes. These were signs of the desperation you were trying so desperately to hide. It was the uniform for a job that didn't exist. The walk to the factory gates or the employment agencies was a pilgrimage of the damned. The streets themselves told the story. Storefronts were boarded up, their windows dusty and vacant. For rent signs hung like forgotten Christmas decorations. Every street corner held clusters of men, their shoulders slumped in a universal posture of defeat. You were part of a silent, shuffling army, marching toward a battle you were guaranteed to lose, with only the rhythmic scuffing of worn leather on pavement as your marching cadence. And then you would arrive at the line. It was perhaps a more soul-crushing invention than the stock ticker that had caused it. A human queue that often stretched for blocks, filled with men who just a year ago were building skyscrapers, forging steel, or managing accounts. Now their only occupation was waiting. They stood in grim silence, avoiding eye contact, united by a shared sense of shame. It wasn't a line for a blockbuster movie, it was a vigil for a dying way of life, and admission was free. The weather became a personal enemy, another layer of misery. To stand for hours in the biting winter wind with only a thin coat and newspapers stuffed in your shoes for insulation was a special kind of quiet torture. The summer was no better, with the sun beating down on the asphalt, turning the air thick with heat and the smell of collective despair, a scent of damp wool, stale tobacco, and fear. The silence was punctuated only by a hacking cough, the distant clang of a streetcar, or the mocking whistle of a factory that was, by some miracle, still running. It was a symphony of stagnation. The line was a microcosm of society, stripped bare. You had skilled tradesmen standing next to young men who had never held a steady job. You had immigrants next to men whose families had been in the country for generations. Status and background were bleached away by the elements. All that mattered was your place in the queue and the fading hope that the foreman might need just one extra hand today. Hope was a dwindling currency, and every day you had less of it. Reaching the front of the line after hours of standing was often the cruelest part of the ritual. More often than not, the reward for your patience was a curt shake of the head or a chalked sign on a board, "No help wanted." The brief flicker of hope you'd nurtured for hours was extinguished in an instant. There was no negotiation, no chance to plead your case. You were simply a surplus item, an unneeded part in a machine that had ground to a halt. And make no mistake, this wasn't just a crisis for the blue-collar worker. The so-called white-collar professional was just as doomed, their suffering merely quieter and more private. Your meticulously crafted resume, your college degree, your years of loyal service in an office, it all meant nothing. A man who once managed a sales team of 50 now found himself competing with teenagers for a job sweeping floors. Your LinkedIn profile, had it existed, would have meant squat when the entire corporate structure had crumbled into dust. The walk home was a march of humiliation. It was often a carefully plotted journey, taking back alleys to avoid the butcher or the landlord to whom you owed money. You'd see a neighbor's furniture piled on the curb. An eviction, a public spectacle of failure that served as a chilling preview of your own possible future. How do you explain, for the 300th day in a row, that you failed? The role of the provider was gone, leaving a hollow space at the center of your identity. This failure fundamentally altered the family structure. Men, stripped of their purpose, would sit in silence while their wives took on mending or laundry for others, bringing in the few coins that kept the family afloat. Children who should have been in school were out on the streets, collecting bottles or bits of scrap metal. The father was no longer the head of the household. He was just another chair at the table, another mouth to feed. For women, the situation was a complicated nightmare. While they had lower unemployment rates, this was largely because they were concentrated in low-paying service jobs that were less likely to disappear entirely. Yet they faced immense social pressure and resentment. A working woman, especially a married one, was often publicly accused of stealing a job from a man, a breadwinner. She was trapped between the necessity of earning a few precious dollars and the scorn of a society that blamed her for its problems. When all hope was exhausted, a desperate search for scapegoats began. It was easier to channel rage than to sit with despair. The blame was thrown around like confetti at a funeral. It was the fault of the bankers on Wall Street, the politicians in Washington, or the immigrants who were supposedly taking all the non-existent jobs. This simmering anger rarely led to revolution. More often, it just curdled into a quiet, bitter resentment that further poisoned the well of community. For some, the shame of the daily line and the emptiness of home became too much to bear. They simply left. They became hobos, a word that fails to capture the sheer desperation of their existence. They walked away from their families and lives, not out of adventure, but because they felt they had become a burden. They rode the rails, crisscrossing the country in a lonely, nomadic search for any kind of work, living in makeshift camps called jungles, and sharing stories of a life they used to know. Perhaps the most underrated horror of unemployment was the sheer, crushing boredom. When the daily, fruitless search for work was over, what was there to do? The hours, days, and weeks stretched into an endless, empty expanse. Men rediscovered the art of doing nothing and found it to be a cruel master. They would study the cracks in the sidewalk with the intensity of a scholar, memorizing their patterns. Time itself became a burden, a thick, slow-moving river of nothingness. To combat this idleness and earn a few cents, a desperate, informal economy emerged. Men who once built cars now sold polished apples. Others participated in grotesque spectacles of endurance like dance marathons, contests where couples would dance for hundreds, even thousands of hours, until they collapsed from exhaustion, all for a cash prize and the entertainment of onlookers. It was human suffering packaged as a sideshow attraction. There was also the slow, creeping obsolescence of the self. A master carpenter who doesn't handle wood for years begins to lose his touch. A skilled machinist's hands forget the feel of the lathe. The intricate knowledge of a trade built over a lifetime began to atrophy from disuse. It was a quiet internal decay, a loss of purpose that mirrored the decay of the factories rusting across the landscape. The country wasn't just losing jobs, it was losing its skills. More than anything, the Depression stole the future. The fundamental American belief in progress, that your children would have a better life than you did, was replaced with the grim hope that they might simply avoid starvation. Long-term planning became a fantasy. Why save for a home you'll never afford? Why dream of a career that will never exist? The horizon of possibility shrank to the edge of the next meal. The government's initial response to this nationwide crisis was, to put it charitably, unhelpful. President Hoover championed the idea of rugged individualism, insisting that citizens and local charities were responsible for relief. This was cold comfort for a man whose children were hungry. It was like telling a drowning person to simply try swimming harder, while simultaneously draining the pool and charging him for the water. And so the lines persisted, becoming a fixed feature of the American landscape. They were a daily testament to a system that had catastrophically failed its people. They were monuments of misery, populated by ghosts of the recent past, all waiting for a future that seemed to have been permanently canceled. As you settle into your own bed, let the dull, rhythmic thought of their endless waiting guide you into a deep, untroubled sleep. They waited so you don't have to. As the economic machine of America ground to a halt, it produced one final, grim product in abundance: homeless people. When the eviction notice was nailed to the door and the last of your savings was gone, you were left with nothing but the clothes on your back and a profound sense of bewilderment. For millions, the loss of a home was the final stage in their descent into poverty. And so across the nation, a new and miserable form of American settlement began to sprout from the barren ground of the Depression. These were not planned communities, they had no architects, no zoning laws, and certainly no welcoming committees. They were shanty towns, cobbled together from the scraps of a broken economy, and, in a stroke of bitter, collective genius, they were given a name that laid the blame squarely at the feet of the man in the White House: Hoovervilles. It was a perfect sarcastic tribute to President Herbert Hoover, whose optimistic assurances about prosperity being just around the corner sounded increasingly hollow from inside a cardboard box. So let us take a quiet, imaginary tour of one of these premier residential developments of the 1930s. First, location. Hoovervilles were typically situated on land that nobody else in their right mind would want. You could find them on the marshy, mosquito-infested banks of a polluted river, in the middle of a city dump, or on the dusty, forgotten outskirts of town. It was the absolute worst real estate in any given city, which made it the perfect spot for people who had been shown that they, too, were considered disposable. The building materials for these fine homes were sourced from the great retail catalog of ruin, the city dump, and the scrap heap. The prospective homeowner became a scavenger, a connoisseur of trash. The shopping list included anything that could provide a flimsy barrier against the wind and rain. Sheets of corrugated tin, flattened tar paper cans, old wooden shipping crates, the doors and hoods of abandoned automobiles, and generous amounts of cardboard. If you could drag it, you could build with it. The resulting architectural style was a chaotic and deeply personal expression of desperation. Each shack was a unique work of art, a testament to its builder's luck at the local landfill that week. There were no straight lines, no uniform designs. Homes leaned against each other for support, creating a maze of narrow, muddy laneways. The aesthetic was less form follows function and more form follows whatever you could find before it rained again. Not exactly the gated communities of your dreams. A glimpse inside one of these Hoover huts revealed a life stripped down to its barest essentials. The interior was often dark, cramped, and damp. An old apple crate might serve as both a chair and a table. The family bed was likely a pile of straw or old rags in a corner. For a touch of interior decorating and a bit of extra insulation, the walls might be papered with old newspapers, allowing you to read yesterday's news of stock market woes while you shivered in your sleep. These homes came with a complete and impressive list of amenities, in that there were absolutely none. Running water was a distant fantasy. It was hauled in buckets, often from a contaminated source a mile away. There was no electricity, so the nights were lit by a flickering candle or the glow from a fire in a rusty oil drum. And of course, there was no sanitation. Toilets were crude pits dug in the ground if you were lucky. The stench was a constant, unwelcome resident. Indeed, Hooverville had a very particular and potent smell. It was a rich bouquet of human misery. The acrid smoke from countless small fires, burning whatever flammable material could be found, the damp, musty odor of rotting cardboard and wet earth, the faint, sweet smell of decay from the nearby garbage dump, and underneath it all, the smell of unwashed bodies and simmering despair. It was an aroma that clung to you, a constant reminder of where you were. And who were the residents of these cardboard castles? The common assumption was that they were inhabited by lazy, shiftless vagrants, but the reality was far more tragic. These were entire families. They were skilled workers from the silent factories, farmers who had lost their land to the banks or the dust, and white-collar clerks whose offices had disappeared overnight. They were a cross-section of the American middle class, now united in a democracy of destitution. Despite the squalor, a fragile sense of community often took root. These were, after all, towns, and they developed their own informal social structures. Many Hoovervilles had an unofficial mayor, usually an older, respected resident who would help mediate disputes. There were unwritten rules of conduct. You didn't steal from your neighbors, who had nothing to steal anyway. You kept your small patch of misery relatively clean, and you helped those who were sick or new to the jungle. This was a community built on the shared experience of hitting rock bottom. Neighbors would watch out for each other's children. If one family managed to get a bit of food, they would often share it, contributing to a communal mulligan stew cooked over an open fire. It was a thin, watery broth, but it was a powerful symbol of their interconnectedness. They were all in the same leaky boat, and they knew they had to paddle together. The daily routine in a Hooverville was a monotonous cycle of survival. The day was spent on a relentless quest for the essentials, scavenging for more building materials to patch the ever-present leaks in your shack, scavenging for fuel to burn for warmth, or cooking, and most importantly, scavenging for food. This meant long walks to the nearest soup kitchen, begging on street corners, or digging through the cast-offs from local markets. And yet, amid the desperation, there was a grim sort of ingenuity at play. A stove could be fashioned from an old oil drum and a bit of pipe. A bed could be made by stuffing a burlap sack with grass. People learned to be master repairmen, patching their shoes with cardboard and their clothes with any available scrap of fabric. It was a testament to the human ability to innovate, even when left with absolutely nothing to work with. For the children who grew up in these shantytowns, childhood was a bleak affair. Their playground was a field of mud and garbage. Their toys were rocks and broken bottles. They were often malnourished, sick, and had little or no access to education. Their young lives were a constant lesson in poverty, hunger, and the harsh realities of a world that had failed their parents. Life in a Hooverville was a constant battle against the elements and disease. The flimsy shacks were fire traps, and a stray spark could incinerate a dozen homes in minutes. A heavy rain could turn the entire settlement into a sea of mud and cause the cardboard walls to disintegrate. And with no sanitation, diseases like typhoid, dysentery, and tuberculosis spread with terrifying speed. The outside world viewed these settlements with a potent mixture of fear and pity. They were an ugly, visible scar on the landscape, a constant reminder of the nation's economic sickness. To the more fortunate, the residents of Hoovervilles were a source of anxiety, a potential threat to public health and safety. The impulse was often not to help, but to simply get rid of the problem. The bitter humor that gave the settlements their name extended to other aspects of life. A newspaper used as a blanket on a cold night was a Hoover blanket. A pocket turned inside out to show it was empty was a Hoover flag. An old car being pulled by a mule because the owner couldn't afford gas was a Hoover wagon. It was a way of coping, of finding a laugh in the darkness. Some of these settlements became quite large and organized. The Hooverville in Seattle had its own unofficial mayor and a population of several thousand. The one in St. Louis was a sprawling city of shacks along the Mississippi River. Most famously, a small Hooverville even sprang up in New York's Central Park, a surreal juxtaposition of extreme poverty and immense wealth. But these communities were always temporary, living on borrowed time. Eventually, the local authorities would decide that the shantytown was a public nuisance or a health hazard. The police would arrive, sometimes with fire departments in tow, and order the residents to vacate. There was rarely any resistance. The residents knew they had no legal right to be there. The eviction was a final, soul-crushing humiliation. Families would gather their few meager possessions, a blanket, a cooking pot, a few family photos, and watch as their makeshift homes were torn down or, more often, set on fire. The smoke rising from a burning Hooverville was a funeral pyre for a community born of desperation. Its residents now forced back onto the open road to start the cycle all over again. The Hooverville thus became the most enduring and potent physical symbol of the Great Depression. It was a monument to failure, both personal and national. It was a testament to the fact that the American dream of a home for every family had, for millions, become a nightmare of cardboard walls and a dirt floor. The memory of these places would be seared into the consciousness of a generation. The fear of losing one's home, of being cast out into a Hooverville, would shape their attitudes towards money, debt, and security for the rest of their lives. It was the ultimate lesson in the fragility of a civilized life. And so our tour of these cardboard castles comes to a close. They were a grim feature of the American landscape for a decade, a testament to the human capacity to endure and to find a strange sort of community even in the most miserable of circumstances. Now, as you settle into your own warm and sturdy home, let the quiet memory of those flimsy shelters guide you into a deep and profoundly grateful sleep. If you thought the Great Depression was exclusively an urban affair of stockbrokers and breadlines, allow us to shift our gaze to the Great Plains, where the universe decided to add an ecological apocalypse to the economic one. For the American farmer, the 1930s weren't just about losing a job. They were about the very earth, rising up in a biblical scale tantrum to actively try and kill you. Turns out, while stockbrokers were jumping out of windows, Mother Nature was demonstrating her own uniquely dark sense of humor. This disaster was in the grand American tradition, mostly our own fault. The decade before, a dangerous idea had taken root. A piece of boosterish propaganda called Rain Follows the Plow. Combined with the post-war demand for wheat and the arrival of efficient new gasoline tractors, this led to the Great Plow-Up. Farmers, encouraged by the government, tore up millions of acres of native prairie grass. This grass, with its deep, tangled root systems, had been the anchor holding the topsoil in place for centuries. We scraped it all away with mechanical efficiency, replacing it with shallow-rooted crops, and essentially unzipped the fly on the greatest environmental disaster in American history. Then, in 1930, the rains just stopped. The once bountiful fields, now stripped of their natural protection, were baked by a relentless sun. The soil, overworked and exposed, turned from fertile loam into a fine, lifeless powder. The earth cracked, the heat became oppressive, and the crops withered and died, leaving the land utterly naked and vulnerable. It was a perfect storm waiting for a breeze, a man-made desert stretching from Texas to Nebraska, and the wind was about to begin a decade-long performance. The first dust storms were a bewildering novelty, but novelty soon gave way to a terrifying routine. They called them dusters or black blizzards. They were not your average breezy day. Imagine a solid wall of dirt 1,000 feet high rolling toward your home like a muddy tsunami in reverse. These were known as rollers, and they had a horrifying beauty to them, tumbling and boiling under their own power. The sky would turn from blue to a sickly brown, then to an unnerving midnight black in the middle of the afternoon. The world would shrink to the four walls of your flimsy farmhouse, and the wind would howl like a legion of banshees. These storms were an assault on every sense. A terrifying silence would sometimes precede them, as birds fell quiet and the air grew heavy. Then came the roar, a deep grinding sound of 1 billion particles of earth scouring the landscape. The air would crackle with static electricity, so much so that a simple handshake could produce a painful blue spark, and metal objects would glow with a faint ghostly light, a phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire. You couldn't see, you could barely breathe, and you were trapped in a world made entirely of dirt. The most legendary of these tempests earned its own morbid title, Black Sunday. On April 14, 1935, a colossal storm, perhaps the worst of the decade, swept across the plains. Temperatures plummeted in minutes as the wall of dust, moving at 60 miles per hour, hit. People caught outside were knocked off their feet, forced to crawl on hands and knees towards the dim light of a nearby house. One boy, desperate to get home, became so disoriented he ran straight past his own house and was found miles away, dead from suffocation. It was this storm that led a reporter to coin the term Dust Bowl, a name that perfectly captured the region's new identity as a hollowed-out basin of despair. For those trapped inside, life became a losing battle against the dust. It was a microscopic invader, relentlessly patient. Housewives would seal their windows and doors with wet rags, gummed paper, and tape, a completely futile gesture. The fine, talcum-like dust would work its way through every crack and keyhole. Before every meal, plates had to be turned upside down on the table until the food was served, and even then, every bite had a gritty texture. At night, families slept with damp cloths over their faces. In the morning, the bedsheets would be coated in a fine brown silt, outlining the shape of where you had slept. This constant inhalation of silica-rich dust had a devastating effect on people's health. A new ailment, dust pneumonia, became tragically common. It was a painful, suffocating condition that started with a persistent cough and ended with lungs so caked and scarred with dirt they could no longer function. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. But beyond this, there were the endless eye infections, the asthma, the sore throats, and a general malaise. It was a slow, gritty form of suffocation, courtesy of your own failed cropland. The livestock didn't stand a chance. Cattle would be found dead in the fields, their lungs and stomachs packed solid with dirt. Those that survived were often blinded by the grit and would sometimes starve to death, unable to find the meager vegetation left. Chickens would suffocate on their roosts. The jackrabbits, once a pest, were now a grim spectacle, found dead by the thousands after every major storm. The entire food chain, from the smallest insect to the largest steer, was choking on the same dust. And if the dust wasn't enough, there were other plagues. As the drought worsened, it drove millions of jackrabbits and swarms of locusts into a desperate search for anything green. They would descend on any field that showed the slightest sign of life, devouring it in minutes. Farmers organized massive rabbit drives, herding thousands of the creatures into pens to be clubbed to death. It was a brutal, bloody affair, a desperate attempt to fight back against a natural world that had become completely unhinged. The psychological toll was immense. Imagine living under a constant state of siege, not from an army but from the sky itself. The world outside your window was actively trying to bury you. The monotonous, dreary landscape with its buried fences and dust drifts piled against barns created a profound sense of hopelessness. Your life's work, your inheritance, your future, it was all literally blowing away on the wind, and there was absolutely nothing you could do to stop it. In the face of such relentless misery, the only defense left was a deeply cynical sense of humor. Jokes as dry as the land itself became a form of currency. They said a man was struck by a single drop of rain and fainted. It took 2 buckets of sand thrown in his face to revive him. They'd say a farmer knew a storm was coming when the rattlesnakes started sneezing, and the most common refrain, uttered as another brown cloud appeared on the horizon, "Well, there goes my neighbor's farm." For hundreds of thousands, the only logical answer was to leave. This was the great Okie migration. They packed their meager belongings into and onto sputtering jalopies, turning Route 66 into a long, slow river of human misery flowing west. The journey itself was an ordeal of blown tires, overheating engines, and dwindling funds. Upon arriving in places like California, they were not welcomed as fellow Americans, but scorned as dumb Okies, treated as a lower class of people and forced to live in squalid migrant camps that were little better than the Hoovervilles they had left behind. The landscape itself was grotesquely transformed. Dust drifted like snow, burying machinery, fences, and sometimes entire homes. The sun was often reduced to a dim, hazy orb for days on end, casting an eerie, brownish light over the world. People would string a clothesline from the back door to the barn just so they could find their way back in the middle of a duster. The very geography of the plains became unstable and hostile. Eventually, the government began to respond, largely thanks to the efforts of one man, Hugh Hammond Bennett, the so-called father of soil conservation. While lobbying Congress for funding in 1935, Bennett stalled his speech, tracking a dust storm that was moving east from the plains. Just as he was making his case, the storm hit Washington, D.C., blotting out the sun. As dust filtered into the Capitol building, Bennett famously said, "This, gentlemen, is what I have been talking about." The Soil Conservation Act was passed shortly thereafter, funding the teaching of new farming techniques and the massive Great Plains Shelter Belt project, an effort to plant millions of trees as windbreaks. Slowly, painfully, things began to change. By the end of the 1930s, the rains started to return, not with any great fanfare, but with a quiet consistency that the plains hadn't seen in a decade. The dust began to settle, the grass began to grow back. The dirty 30s were finally, mercifully, coming to a close. The war with the sky was ending in a truce. So as you lie in your comfortable bed, let us remember the farmers of the Dust Bowl. Theirs was a unique chapter in the annals of misery, a time when the abstract horror of economic collapse was paired with the tangible terror of a world turning to dust. It was a man-made catastrophe of biblical proportions, a long, dull, and dreary lesson in humility, written across the sky in 10 billion tons of dirt. Now sleep, and be grateful for the simple, boring stillness of the air around you. As the dust settled on the Great Plains or the bank foreclosed on the family farm, an entire population of American workers found themselves untethered. They were no longer farmers because they had no farm. They were no longer townsfolk because their towns had withered and died. They were something new, something unfortunate, migrants. And so began one of the great and most miserable road trips in American history, a desperate exodus west. This wasn't a journey of adventure. It was a slow-motion evacuation from a life that had ceased to exist. The siren song pulling them west came in the form of brightly colored handbills. These flimsy pieces of paper distributed by farm owners and labor contractors promised a veritable paradise in California. Pickers wanted, they screamed in bold letters. Good wages, a full season's work. They depicted lush fields overflowing with fruit and happy families basking in the sun. It was the 1930s version of a spam email promising you've won the lottery. For a family staring at a barren field of dust, it was a lie they desperately wanted to believe. The vessel for this journey was the family jalopy, a term that feels too charming for the rusted, sputtering machines that carried these families. These were Model Ts and old touring cars, purchased for a few dollars, already well past their prime. They were less automobiles and more mobile piles of junk, held together with baling wire, prayer, and a stubborn refusal to die. They were hearses for a former life, burdened with the ghosts of a failed farm. Packing for this final journey was an exercise in ruthless arithmetic. You couldn't take the family piano or the heavy oak furniture. You took what was essential for survival and what was too painful to leave behind. A mattress was strapped to the roof, hoping it wouldn't fly off in the wind. A few pots and pans, a water can, some basic tools for the inevitable breakdown, and perhaps a family Bible were crammed inside. Every object was weighed against its value in a future that was completely unknown. The primary artery for this westward bleed was U.S. Route 66. John Steinbeck would later call it the Mother Road, a name that captured its central role in this story. It was a two-lane ribbon of asphalt and dirt stretching from Chicago to Los Angeles, a path of hope that, for most, would curdle into a long, drawn-out road of despair. It became a conveyor belt of humanity, carrying the dispossessed toward a dream that was already overcrowded. The daily grind of the road was one of punishing monotony. The goal was to cover as many miles as possible before the car overheated or a tire blew. Families would drive from dawn until dusk, the landscape outside the window changing from the brown plains to the red deserts with agonizing slowness. The trip was punctuated by a constant nagging search for two things: cheap gasoline to feed the car, and clean water to keep the family alive. Mechanical failure wasn't a possibility, it was a certainty. These jalopies were ticking time bombs. A blown tire, a cracked radiator, a failed transmission, any of these could spell the end of the journey. The roadside became a graveyard of abandoned cars. For those with a bit of luck and mechanical skill, a breakdown was just a delay. They would tinker and patch, using salvaged parts and sheer ingenuity to coax a few more miles out of the dying machine. When night fell, there were no cheerful motels. The migrant families would pull over to the side of the road and form makeshift camps. These were little Hoovervilles on wheels. Families would cluster together for safety and a semblance of community. They would build small fires, cook a meager meal of beans or potatoes, and talk in low voices about the miles covered and the miles still to go. The children would sleep in the car or on the hard ground. There was a clear and visible hierarchy on the road. The migrant families in their sputtering jalopies were the lowest caste. They were met with suspicion and contempt by the locals in the towns they passed through. Service station owners would often charge them more for gas, and store owners would watch them like hawks. They were a visible, mobile reminder of the nation's poverty, and nobody wanted that reminder parking in front of their business. The final leg of the journey was often the most perilous, crossing the deserts of Arizona and California. The heat was suffocating, turning the inside of the cars into ovens. Water was scarce and precious, rationed out in tiny sips. Many cars, and some people, simply did not survive the crossing. To break down in the middle of the Mojave Desert was a potential death sentence. And if you survived the desert, you were greeted at the California border by a new obstacle, the police. In a move of questionable legality, the Los Angeles Police Department established what became known as the bum blockade. They posted officers at the major entry points into the state to stop and turn back any travelers who looked too poor. They were looking for indigents, which was a convenient label for anyone whose car was old and whose face was etched with desperation. On finally entering the so-called Promised Land, the dream immediately began to fray. The migrants discovered that the handbills had been sent to everyone. The roads were clogged with thousands of other families, all heading for the same orchards and fields, all desperately seeking the same jobs. The supply of labor was immense, and the demand was finite. The immediate impression was not one of hope, but of overwhelming competition. It was here that the word Okie was transformed. Originally a neutral term for someone from Oklahoma, it was now spat out as a derogatory slur. It became a blanket term for any poor white Dust Bowl refugee, regardless of their state of origin. It meant you were ignorant, dirty, and a drain on society. It was a label of shame slapped on people who, just a few years earlier, had been proud land-owning farmers. The reality of the work was a cruel joke. The good wages promised on the handbills were a fantasy. Most agricultural labor was paid on a piece rate system. You weren't paid by the hour, you were paid by the basket, or crate. With so many workers competing for the same jobs, the price per basket was driven down to almost nothing. You could work from sunup to sundown and still not earn enough to feed your family for the day. Overseeing this system was the labor contractor. This was the middleman who hired the crews for the large growers. They were often manipulative figures who would promise a certain wage and then lower it once the workers were already in the fields, knowing they had no other options. They held all the power, and the migrants were completely at their mercy. The living conditions were appalling. Most migrants ended up in private labor camps run by the growers. These were collections of crude shacks, tents, or sometimes just open fields where you were expected to set up your own shelter. There was rarely any running water, and sanitation consisted of a few overflowing pit toilets for hundreds of people. These camps were breeding grounds for disease and despair. The diet of a migrant worker was as meager as their pay. Families subsisted on a monotonous diet of beans, potatoes, and bread when they could afford it. Sometimes they ate what was known as culls, the bruised or damaged fruit and vegetables that couldn't be sold. Malnutrition was a constant, weakening bodies and making them more susceptible to illness. Sickness was a constant threat. With no sanitation and rampant malnutrition, diseases like typhoid, diphtheria, and tuberculosis spread like wildfire through the camps. A sick child was a parent's greatest fear, as there was no money for doctors or medicine. Many children died from preventable illnesses in the squalor of the fields. The hostility from the established residents of California was palpable. Okies were seen as a blight. Their children were bullied in schools, signs saying "No Okies" appeared in store windows. They were blamed for driving down wages and overwhelming relief agencies. They were treated as foreign invaders in their own country, scorned for the crime of being poor. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. It was a systematic stripping away of dignity. These were people who had valued their independence above all else. Now they were forced to beg for work, live in filth, and endure constant humiliation. The sense of failure was a heavy burden, straining marriages and crushing spirits. As the crisis deepened, the federal government stepped in, establishing a number of Farm Security Administration, or FSA, camps. These government-run camps were a world away from the private ones. They were still basic, with simple wooden cabins or platforms for tents, but they had clean water, toilets, and showers. They offered a measure of sanitation and safety that was a lifesaver for many. In these FSA camps, and even in the squalid private ones, the migrants clung to what they had left, their culture. On Saturday nights, they would gather for music. Men would bring out their fiddles and guitars, playing the old songs they had brought with them from back home. These gatherings were a vital source of community, a brief respite from the misery, a way of reminding themselves that they were more than just okays. But for most, the dream of California died a slow, painful death. There was no golden opportunity, no chance to save up and buy a small plot of land. There was only the next harvest, the next temporary job, the next squalid camp. The journey west had not been a solution, it had just been a change of scenery for the same suffering. And so our chapter on this weary pilgrimage concludes. It was a journey of 1,000 miles that ended in a place of profound disappointment. The open road, that great American symbol of freedom and opportunity, had become a trail of tears for a generation of displaced workers. It was just a scenic road trip, if scenic means starving on the side of the highway. Now, let the hum of that endless dusty road lull you into a deep and settled sleep. As the Great Depression deepened, it introduced a new grim ritual into the daily lives of millions. With jobs gone and savings vanished, the simple act of eating became the primary struggle of the day. And so, a new kind of restaurant scene emerged, catering to a clientele whose only currency was their time and their pride. Welcome, weary traveler, to the most exclusive dining experience of the 1930C. The soup kitchen and the bread line. 5-star dining? More like a half-starving, hour-long wait for a half-star meal. These establishments were the great equalizers of the era. They popped up in church basements, abandoned storefronts, and drafty warehouses. They were the town squares of misery, the social clubs for the destitute. Here, a former stockbroker could stand shoulder to shoulder with a laid-off factory worker, both united by the universal, democratic language of a rumbling, empty stomach. It was the only club in town where nobody wanted to be a member, but the waiting list was a mile long. Let us peruse the menu, a culinary offering defined by its stunning consistency and minimalist approach. The prix-fixe menu for the day, and indeed for the entire decade, consisted of 2 main courses, soup and bread. For liquid refreshment, there was often a bracing, lukewarm beverage that was optimistically referred to as coffee. There were no appetizers, no desserts, and certainly no substitutions. The chef's special was whatever had been donated that morning. The soup itself was a masterpiece of abstract cuisine. It was less a hearty broth and more a vaguely flavored water that had once been acquainted with a vegetable. The primary ingredient was water, followed by more water. Floating in this transparent medium might be a few lonely chunks of potato, some wilted cabbage leaves, or perhaps a mysterious piece of gristle that defied identification. The goal of the soup was not to delight the palate, but merely to provide a warm liquid to fill the aching void in one's stomach. The silent, starchy hero of this culinary tragedy was the bread. It was often day-old or several days old, donated by bakeries that couldn't sell it. It was dry, it was tough, and it was the most substantial thing you were likely to eat all day. This was the ballast of the meal. You would tear it into pieces and drop it into your watery soup, where it would absorb the liquid and swell into a soggy, edible mass. It was a partnership born of pure necessity. The ambiance of these dining halls was consistently, breathtakingly grim. The decor was early American warehouse, featuring long wooden tables, splintery benches, and the pervasive smell of boiled cabbage and damp wool. The lighting was poor, the air was thick with the quiet sighs of exhausted men, and the only music was the clatter of tin cups and the shuffling of tired feet. It was a place utterly devoid of joy. To secure a table at one of these fine establishments, one did not need a reservation, but rather a profound capacity for standing still. The bread line was the reservation system. It would form in the cold pre-dawn hours, a long, shuffling queue of human misery that snaked around city blocks. Your place in line was your ticket to a single cup of soup or a loaf of stale bread. People would wait for hours, silently, for their turn. The wait was a physical ordeal. In the winter, men would stand in threadbare coats, shivering against the biting wind, their feet numb with cold. In the summer, they would bake on the hot pavement under a relentless sun. Rain or snow, the line persisted. It was a testament to the power of hunger, a force that could make a person endure almost any discomfort for the promise of a few hundred calories. The social dynamic of the line was a study in shared, unspoken shame. There was very little conversation. Men would stare at the pavement, at the back of the person in front of them, anywhere but at each other. To make eye contact was to acknowledge the shared failure, the collective humiliation of being reduced to this. They were a silent congregation, gathered to worship at the altar of economic collapse. And who was this congregation? It was everyone. The stereotype of the bum in the breadline was a comforting lie for those still employed. In reality, these were skilled carpenters, laid-off accountants, former shop owners, and young men who had never even had a first job. They wore their old work clothes, now frayed and worn, like the ghosts of the lives they used to live. The etiquette was strict and unspoken. You did not complain. You did not cause a scene. You did not, under any circumstances, cut in line. To do so was to violate the fragile, unwritten code of the desperate. Everyone was in the same boat, and rocking it would only serve to drown you all faster. You stood, you waited, you took what was given, and you disappeared back into the city. Interestingly, the role of celebrity chef was sometimes filled by the most unlikely of characters. In Chicago, the most famous soup kitchen was run by the notorious gangster Al Capone. In a brilliant, if cynical, public relations move, Capone opened a kitchen that served 3 free meals a day to thousands of unemployed men. It was a way to launder his public image and thumb his nose at the government that was trying to imprison him. Capone's operation was, by all accounts, impressively efficient. His men served the soup and bread with no questions asked and no sermon attached. The food was simple, but it was reliable. For the men in line, it didn't matter that the hand ladling out their soup was connected to organized crime. Hunger has a way of erasing such moral complexities. A full stomach, even one provided by a mobster, was better than an empty one. Of course, most kitchens were run by more traditional benefactors like the Salvation Army or local church groups. These organizations did heroic work feeding millions with dwindling resources. However, a meal at a religious mission sometimes came with a string attached, a mandatory prayer meeting or a sermon. For a man whose only prayer was for a job, sitting through a lecture on morality to get a bowl of soup was another small, bitter pill to swallow. For many men, the greatest pain was not their own hunger, but the loss of their role as a provider. To be a man in this era was to work and support your family. The breadline was a public declaration that you had failed in this fundamental duty. This erosion of dignity was one of the deepest wounds of the Depression, a psychological scar that lingered long after the economy recovered. The shame was so intense that many fathers couldn't bear to stand in the line themselves. They would send their wives or even their young children, a heart-wrenching admission of defeat. The sight of a small child holding a bucket, waiting patiently for a portion of soup to take home to their family, was a common and soul-crushing spectacle. For women, the experience was uniquely difficult. A woman in a breadline was often viewed with even greater suspicion or pity. She was not only a symbol of poverty, but also of a broken home. She had to navigate the physical hardship of the weight, while also enduring the silent judgment of a society that still believed a woman's place was in a home that in all likelihood she no longer had. And what of the coffee? It was the sad, liquid epilogue to the meal. It was brewed from grounds that had likely been used several times already, resulting in a brownish water that bore only a passing resemblance to the real thing. It was served without milk or sugar, and its primary virtue was that it was wet and warm, a small comfort against the cold indifference of the world. The moment of service was a brief, impersonal transaction. You would shuffle forward, hold out your tin cup or bowl, and a volunteer would ladle in a portion of soup. There was no time for pleasantries. The goal was efficiency, to move the line along, to process the human backlog of hunger as quickly as possible. The clatter of the ladle against the tin cup was the sound of survival. The meal itself was consumed quickly, without ceremony. Men would stand against a wall or huddle on a curb, hunched over their bowls, eating with a quiet urgency. There was no savoring the flavor, for there was none to savor. It was fuel, plain and simple. It was the biological necessity of consumption, stripped of all its social and cultural meaning. When the last drop of soup was gone and the last crumb of bread was swallowed, there was no feeling of satisfaction. There was only a temporary reprieve. The gnawing ache in the stomach was silenced for a few hours, but the anxiety remained. The question that dominated every waking thought was not, what did I have for lunch, but where will I find dinner? The breadline became the defining public image of the Great Depression. It was a stark, visual representation of the economy's collapse. Each person in that line was a story of a lost job, a failed business, a foreclosed farm. They were a silent, damning portrait of a nation in crisis, a daily reminder that the American dream was, for many, now being served out of a soup kettle. And so our culinary review of Depression-era dining concludes. It was a time when a meal was not a source of pleasure, but a temporary halt in the long, monotonous grind of starvation. It was a ritual of humility, a daily lesson in the art of expecting nothing and being grateful for even that. Now let the quiet, orderly rhythm of that miserable line guide you into a deep and blessedly untroubled sleep. As the Great Depression methodically dismantled the American economy, it began to rewrite the rules of society in the most desperate ways. When a father's job disappeared and the breadwinner could no longer win bread, families were forced to look for new and often smaller sources of income. In the grim calculus of survival, a horrifyingly logical answer emerged: the children. And so the nation witnessed a great leap backward, a resurgence of child labor that turned the clock back decades and redefined the very concept of childhood. Turns out, your kids can be your best assets when you're truly desperate. This wasn't a matter of kids doing a few chores for pocket money. This was the systematic employment of children in some of the most dangerous and grueling industries in the country. From an employer's perspective, the logic was both simple and monstrous. Children were cheap, often earning a fraction of what an adult would be paid. They were compliant, less likely to organize or cause trouble, and their small bodies and nimble fingers were often perfectly suited for tasks that were too delicate or dangerous for a full-grown adult. They were, in short, the perfect exploitable workforce. For decades, progressive reformers had fought to pull children out of the factories and mines and put them into schools. By the 1920s, it seemed like they had largely succeeded, but the Depression, with its tidal wave of poverty, washed away much of that progress. Economic desperation became the ultimate excuse, overriding moral objections. The sight of a 10-year-old coming home covered in coal dust was no longer an outrage. For many, it was simply a sign that the family would eat that night. Nowhere was this grim reality more apparent than in the coal mines of Appalachia and Pennsylvania. Here, young boys, some as young as 8, worked as breaker boys. Their job was to sit for 10 to 12 hours a day on a hard wooden plank, hunched over a chute of cascading coal. Their task was to pick out the pieces of slate and other impurities with their bare hands as the coal rushed past. It was dark, deafening, and mind-numbingly monotonous. The air in the breaker rooms was thick with a black, suffocating dust that coated everything and worked its way deep into the boys' lungs. The constant leaning over the chutes led to curved spines and stooped shoulders. The sharp slate would cut their fingers to the bone, but they were expected to work through the pain. The noise of the machinery was so loud it was impossible to hear someone shouting next to you. It was a job that systematically destroyed a child's body for a few cents an hour. Meanwhile, in the textile mills of the South, it was often young girls who formed the backbone of the workforce. They worked as doffers and spinners, their small hands ideal for the delicate task of replacing full bobbins with empty ones, or retying broken threads on the massive spinning frames. The air here wasn't filled with coal dust, but with cotton lint, which was just as damaging to the lungs. The roar of hundreds of looms was a constant, deafening assault. The machinery in these mills was built for efficiency, not safety. There were no guards on the moving parts. A moment of distraction, an exhausted stumble, or a stray piece of clothing could lead to a catastrophic accident. Girls would lose fingers, hands, or have their hair caught in the belts and gears. These were not considered tragic accidents, they were simply a routine cost of doing business, a sad but accepted part of mill life. But the single largest employer of children during the Great Depression was agriculture. On farms across the country, particularly among sharecropper and migrant families, the concept of a non-working child simply didn't exist. From the moment they could walk, children were put to work in the fields. They picked cotton, harvested beets, and topped onions alongside their parents. Their small stature was an advantage for stoop labor, the back-breaking work of harvesting low-green crops. In farming, the entire family was a single economic unit. A child's small hands could pick berries without bruising them, and their contribution, however small, was essential. The pay was often by the pound or by the basket, so every member of the family had to work from sunup to sundown just to make enough to survive. There was no school, no playtime, just the endless, repetitive motion of the harvest. In the cities, a different kind of child labor flourished on the streets. These were the newsies, boys who would hawk newspapers on street corners, their voices shouting headlines they were often too young to fully understand. There were the bootblacks, kneeling on the pavement to shine the shoes of the few men who could still afford such a luxury. And there were the messenger boys, weaving through traffic on bicycles, a vital part of the city's communication network. Another hidden world of child labor existed within the cramped tenement apartments of major cities. This was piecework. Entire families, including the youngest children, would huddle around a dim lamp, their fingers flying to complete a task for a garment factory or a toy manufacturer. They would sew buttons, assemble artificial flowers, or shell nuts for pennies apiece. The home was transformed into a tiny, unregulated factory. The wages paid to these children were a cruel joke. A boy in a coal mine might earn 50 cents for a 10-hour day. A girl in a textile mill might make $1 or $2 for a 60-hour week. Often payment wasn't even in cash, but in scrip. Company-issued tokens that could only be spent at the overpriced company store. This system ensured that families remained permanently in debt to their employer. This influx of cheap child labor had a devastating ripple effect on the entire economy. Why would a factory owner hire a father for 30 cents an hour when he could hire his 10-year-old son for 5? This dynamic drove down wages for everyone. Adults were forced to compete with their own children for jobs, creating a vicious cycle where poverty beget more poverty. For this generation of children, education became an unaffordable luxury. School attendance plummeted. Many children dropped out of school to work full-time. In impoverished rural areas, many school districts simply went bankrupt and closed their doors altogether. The choice was not between going to school or going to work. It was between going to work or going hungry. This created a grim sort of school-to-work pipeline, though pipeline implies a choice of destination. For millions of children, there was no choice. Their future was predetermined by their family's poverty. Their education ended in the 3rd or 4th grade, and their career path led directly to the mine, the mill, or the field. An entire generation was robbed of its potential. The long-term physical consequences were severe. Malnutrition combined with grueling physical labor led to stunted growth and a host of chronic health problems. The curved spines of the breaker boys, the persistent coughs of the mill girls, the weathered skin of the young field hands. These were the physical marks of a stolen childhood. The mental and emotional toll was just as profound. These children were denied the basic right to be children. There was no time for play, for laughter, or for dreams beyond the next meager paycheck. They were miniature adults, burdened with the worries and responsibilities of a grown-up world, their faces old before their time. The legal battle to end child labor had been raging for decades, but the Depression gave its opponents a powerful new argument: necessity. While reformers pointed to the moral outrage of child exploitation, business owners and desperate parents pointed to the reality of starvation. State laws against child labor were often weak and riddled with loopholes, particularly for agriculture, which was frequently exempted entirely. These loopholes were large enough to drive a truck through. A law might prohibit a child from working in a factory, but it didn't prohibit them from doing piecework for that same factory in their own home. It might set a minimum age for industrial work, but have no restrictions at all for a child working on their own family's farm, even if that family farm was a sharecropper plot owned by a large corporation. Employers, when challenged, would often frame their hiring of children as a benevolent act. They would argue that they were providing food for a hungry family, teaching children the value of hard work, and keeping them off the streets and out of trouble. It was a self-serving justification that ignored the broken bodies and stolen futures that were the true cost of their cheap labor. For the parents, it was a heart-wrenching and impossible choice. No parent wanted to send their child into a dangerous mine or a deafening mill, but the alternative was often watching that same child go to bed hungry night after night. It was less a choice and more a coercion, a decision made with the cold logic of survival when all other options had been exhausted. The tide finally began to turn in 1938 with the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. This landmark piece of federal legislation, a cornerstone of the New Deal, set a national minimum wage, established the 40-hour workweek, and, crucially, set federal limits on child labor for the first time. It prohibited the employment of minors in most non-agricultural jobs. The law was not a magic wand. It didn't end child labor overnight, and powerful agricultural interests ensured that farm work remained largely exempt for years to come. But it was a monumental shift. It established a national standard that declared that the exploitation of children was no longer an acceptable business practice in the United States, no matter how dire the economic circumstances. And so we look back on this unsung workforce, this army of small hands and tired faces that helped keep the wheels of a broken economy turning. Their sacrifice was immense, their childhoods traded for a few dollars a week to keep their families from sinking. They were the invisible casualties of the Depression, their stories written in the coal dust on their faces and the lint in their lungs. Now let the quiet, monotonous rhythm of their forgotten labor guide you into a deep and peaceful sleep. As the economic devastation of the Great Depression settled in, it performed one final, cruel act of erasure. It took away people's homes. When the farm was foreclosed, the eviction notice was served, or the landlord finally lost his patience, millions of Americans found themselves without a roof over their heads. They spilled out onto the streets and highways, a new and tragic demographic of the dispossessed. For these workers and their families, the concept of home became a distant memory, and the open road became their bleak and unwelcoming address. This wasn't just aimless wandering, it was a desperate, mobile search for survival. This era saw the dramatic rise of the hobo, a figure that has been romanticized in folk songs but whose reality was anything but. These were not carefree spirits seeking adventure. They were unemployed men, displaced farmers, and even scores of teenagers constantly moving in a frantic, nationwide search for any kind of work. They formed a nomadic nation within a nation, a rolling republic of the ruin. In a way, they were practicing the ultimate minimalist lifestyle, just without the Instagram aesthetics. They owned only what they could carry. They had no mortgage, no rent, and no utility bills. They embraced a life of transience and non-attachment. Of course, this was not a voluntary philosophical choice made at a yoga retreat. It was a lifestyle of last resort, forced upon them by a society that had declared them surplus to requirements. Their minimalism was not a virtue, it was the simple, stark reality of having absolutely nothing. The primary mode of transportation for this new nomadic class was the American freight train. It was the Iron Highway, a sprawling, interconnected network that went everywhere a job might possibly be. Best of all, it was free, provided you were willing to break the law and risk your life on a daily basis. The freight train became the hobo's best friend and most dangerous enemy, the vessel that carried them from one hopeless town to the next. The act of illegally boarding a train was a skill known as catching out. It required timing, agility, and a healthy dose of desperation. A hobo would wait in the railroad yard or alongside a slow-moving stretch of track, and as the train chugged past, they would run alongside it, grab onto a ladder, and swing themselves up into an open boxcar. A misstep, a clumsy grab, a moment of hesitation, and the massive steel wheels would do the rest. For the truly daring or the truly desperate, there were more dangerous ways to travel. The most perilous was riding the rods. This involved climbing underneath a boxcar and lying on the thin steel rods of the undercarriage, just inches away from the spinning wheels and the blur of the track below. It was a terrifying, bone-jarring ride, and falling asleep meant certain death. It was the cheapest ticket to hell you could find. A slightly less suicidal, though still incredibly dangerous option, was decking it. This meant climbing onto the curved roof of a boxcar and lying flat, exposed to the elements. The wind was ferocious, the cinders from the locomotive were blinding, and the constant threat of being knocked off by a low bridge or a tunnel entrance meant that a moment's inattention could be your last. It was a bed with a lethal view. The main human antagonist in this dangerous game was the railroad police, universally known and feared as bulls. These were not friendly neighborhood cops. They were often brutal men hired by the railroad companies to keep transients off the trains. They would patrol the yards with clubs and guns, and they were notorious for beating hobos senseless, or worse, for simply throwing them from a moving train. And if the bulls didn't get you, the local law might. Vagrancy was illegal, and a hobo caught in the wrong town could be arrested on the spot. The punishment was often a 30-day jail sentence, which might include forced labor on a county work farm or a chain gang. Getting caught was not just an inconvenience, it was a descent into another level of misery, a brief, state-sanctioned period of slavery. To survive, hobos created their own parallel society. Near most major railroad yards, you could find a hobo jungle. These were makeshift encampments hidden away in a grove of trees or under a bridge. They were a place where a traveler could rest without being harassed, share information, and find a small measure of safety among their own kind. It was the hobo's version of a town square and a temporary sanctuary. Life in the jungle was governed by a strict, unwritten code of ethics. You were expected to respect other people's property, such as it was. You were to help keep the camp clean. You were not to make trouble that would attract the attention of the law. And if you had food, you were expected to share. It was a fragile, self-policing society built on a foundation of mutual desperation. The centerpiece of many jungles was a large communal cooking pot where a mulligan stew was almost always brewing. This was a hobo's stone soup. Everyone would contribute whatever they had managed to beg, find, or steal that day. A few potatoes, a stolen turnip, a handful of dandelions, perhaps a scrawny chicken. It was a thin, unpredictable, but often life-saving meal. Within this transient world, there was a clear social hierarchy. A hobo was someone who traveled and looked for work. A tramp was someone who traveled but actively avoided work. And at the bottom was the bum, who neither traveled nor worked. These distinctions were important. A self-respecting hobo took pride in his willingness to work, even if there was no work to be found. To navigate their dangerous world, hobos developed a secret language, a system of symbols and signs that they would chalk or carve near railroad tracks, on fences, or on buildings. This hobo code was a way to leave messages for those who came after them. It was a silent, visual network of crucial information, a guidebook for survival written on the landscape itself. These symbols could tell you everything you needed to know. A simple cross might mean that the local church offered a free meal. A drawing of a cat signified that a kind-hearted lady lived in the nearby house. A circle with 2 arrows meant to get out of town fast, as hobos were not welcome. A drawing of a stick figure behind bars warned of a particularly aggressive police presence. It was a language of survival, learned on the road. One of the most tragic aspects of this transient population was its age. It is estimated that over 250,000 teenagers were riding the rails during the Depression. These were boys, and a smaller number of girls, who had left home for one of 2 reasons, either to find adventure, or, more often, so there would be one less mouth for their starving family to feed. They were children, forced into a dangerous and lonely adulthood. The lost girls of the rails faced even greater perils. A lone woman was an easy target for violence. To survive, many would disguise themselves as boys, cutting their hair short, wearing men's clothes, and learning to adopt a tough exterior. Their story is one of incredible bravery and profound vulnerability, a largely hidden chapter in the history of the homeless. The daily routine of a hobo was a monotonous cycle of survival. You would wake up cold and damp in a jungle, spend the day on the stem, which meant walking the streets of a town looking for a handout or an odd job, and then try to catch out on a train heading towards the next possibility. It was a life of constant motion that ultimately went nowhere. The hustle was relentless. A hobo would approach a house and offer to chop wood, sweep the porch, or do any small task in exchange for a meal. This was preferable to outright begging, as it allowed for a small measure of dignity, but often it came down to simply knocking on a back door and asking humbly if there were any leftovers you could have. The weather was a constant, implacable enemy. A summer heat wave could kill you with thirst. A winter blizzard, if you were caught in an uninsulated boxcar, or a poorly sheltered jungle, could freeze you to death. Without 4 walls and a roof, you were completely at the mercy of the elements, and they were rarely merciful. This life of constant movement, anonymity, and suspicion eroded a person's sense of self. You were no longer John Smith, the carpenter from Ohio. You were just another faceless drifter, known only by a road nickname like Slim or Chipper. You lost your connection to your past, your community, and your own identity. You became a ghost, haunting the fringes of a society that had discarded you. There was a romantic myth of the hobo as a free spirit, a man who had shed the burdens of society to live a life of carefree adventure. The reality was the complete opposite. It was a life defined not by freedom, but by its absence. You were not free when you were constantly hungry, constantly afraid of the bulls, and constantly lonely. It was a prison without walls. What became of this transient army? There was no single end to the story. Some eventually found work and settled down. Many died young from accidents, disease, or violence on the rails. Others simply kept moving until the economic boom of World War II finally created enough jobs to absorb them back into the workforce. The war, ironically, was the final destination for many. And so we leave this chapter on the homeless, the wanderers, the riders of the rails. They were a living, moving testament to the profound dislocation of the Great Depression. Their home was nowhere and everywhere, their journey a long, monotonous, and lonely search for a place that no longer existed. Now, let the rhythmic, endless clatter of those steel wheels on the track guide you into a deep and settled sleep. While the Great Depression played out on the grand stage of crashing stock markets and sprawling breadlines, its most intimate and arguably most painful drama took place behind the closed doors of the family home. The economic crisis was like a corrosive acid seeping through the floorboards and eating away at the very foundations of marriage and family life. This was the final battleground where the national emergency became a personal, psychological war of attrition. The home was no longer a refuge from the storm, it was the center of it. For millions of couples, the traditional wedding vow of for richer, for poorer took on a grimly literal meaning with a heavy emphasis on the poorer part. The promise to stay together in sickness and in health was now being tested by a sickness of the entire economic system. The Depression would stretch the bonds of matrimony to their absolute breaking point, proving that, while love might be patient, it has a hard time paying the rent. The first casualty of this domestic crisis was romance itself. For young couples hoping to start a life together, the future was suddenly canceled. Marriage rates plummeted during the early 1930s. A marriage license cost a few dollars, a sum that might otherwise buy food for a week. And beyond the license, there was the simple, insurmountable problem of not being able to afford a place to live. And so courtships were endlessly prolonged and engagements stretched into a seemingly permanent state of waiting. Following this trend, the national birth rate went into a nosedive. The children born during this era would later be known as the Depression cohort, a generation significantly smaller than the one before it. This wasn't due to a lack of affection, but a surplus of cold, hard math. A new baby meant another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, another expense in a budget that had already been stripped bare. For millions of couples, the most responsible and loving decision they could make was to not bring a child into a world of such profound uncertainty. In a strange statistical twist, the divorce rate also dropped significantly. This was not a sign of newfound marital bliss. On the contrary, it was a sign of a new kind of trap. Divorce required legal fees, and it meant one household splitting into two, doubling the cost of rent and utilities. For many unhappy couples, a divorce was simply an unaffordable luxury. They were financially tethered together, unable to separate even when the relationship had completely disintegrated. This led to the rise of what sociologists called the empty shell marriage. From the outside, the family unit appeared intact, but inside, the emotional core had rotted away. Husband and wife lived as bitter, silent roommates under the same roof. They were bound not by love or companionship, but by a shared poverty and a lack of any other options. The home became a cold, quiet prison for two. At the heart of this domestic tragedy was the psychological devastation of the unemployed man. For generations, a man's identity, his very sense of self-worth, was inextricably linked to his role as the breadwinner. When his job was taken away, it felt as though his manhood had been taken with it. He was no longer the provider, the head of the household. He was just another piece of useless furniture, sitting in a corner and consuming resources. This feeling of emasculation was a quiet, gnawing poison. The daily routine of a jobless man was a study in futility. He would leave the house in the morning to look for work he knew didn't exist, just to maintain the pretense of purpose. He would return in the evening, empty-handed and defeated, to face the silent, worried eyes of his family. The shame was immense, and it often manifested as depression, alcoholism, or a simmering, angry resentment. As the man's role in the family shrank, the woman's expanded in ways she had never anticipated. Women became the primary shock absorbers for the family's economic distress. They were tasked with the impossible, managing a household with almost no money. Their lives became a frantic, endless effort to make something out of nothing, to hold the family together while the world outside fell apart. The Depression turned housewives into master economists of poverty. They learned to stretch a single potato into a meal for four. They patched and repatched clothing until it was more stitched than fabric. They obsessively saved bits of string and old rags because everything had a potential future use. It was a life of relentless, soul-crushing thrift, a constant battle against entropy and hunger, fought on the terrain of the kitchen table. To bring in a few precious cents, women turned their homes into small businesses. Many took in boarders, renting out a spare room, a sofa, or even just a corner of the floor to a stranger. This provided a little cash, but it shattered the family's privacy and added another layer of tension to an already crowded home. Others took in laundry, their hands raw from scrubbing other people's clothes, or did sewing and mending for neighbors. The presence of a boarder was a particularly awkward arrangement. This was a stranger living in your most intimate space, sharing your meager meals and your cramped bathroom. It was a constant reminder of your financial desperation. Every interaction was colored by the unspoken reality that this person's weekly payment was the only thing keeping your family from being evicted. When work from home wasn't enough, many married women sought jobs in the outside world, a decision that was met with widespread public hostility. The prevailing sentiment was that a working woman, especially a married one, was stealing a job from a man who rightfully deserved it. This ignored the reality that her family was just as desperate as any other. The irony was that the jobs available to women were almost always in low-main, gender-segregated fields that men wouldn't have considered anyway. These were positions as secretaries, telephone operators, maids, or department store clerks. The pay was abysmal, but it was something. A woman might endure a day of public scorn and low wages, but come home with enough money to buy milk and bread, a victory her unemployed husband could not achieve. This shift in economic roles inevitably led to a quiet and often deeply resented shift in the family power dynamic. A man who was no longer earning an income found his authority within the home diminished. His wife, who was now managing the budget and perhaps even earning the only steady cash, gained a new and often unwelcome degree of influence. This reversal of traditional roles was a source of immense friction. The atmosphere in many Depression-era homes was not one of loud, dramatic arguments. It was far more often a heavy, suffocating silence. Couples stopped talking to each other because there was nothing to say that wasn't about their lack of money and their bleak future. Resentment simmered beneath the surface, unspoken but felt by everyone. The silence was a defense mechanism against the pain of their shared reality. Children were the silent witnesses to this domestic decay. They learned to be quiet, to be invisible, to not cause any trouble that might add to their parents' already immense stress. They could feel the tension in the air, even if they couldn't understand its source. Many children came to feel, in a vague but powerful way, that they themselves were a burden, another mouth to feed in a family that had too many. The economic pressure often forced families to double or triple up. A young couple might move back in with their parents. A brother who had lost his home might move in with his wife and children. These crowded living conditions, with multiple families sharing a small space, were a recipe for conflict. The constant lack of privacy, the arguments over food, and the clash of personalities made home life a waking nightmare. For some men, the shame and helplessness became too much to bear. They simply walked away. This was the phenomenon of domestic abandonment, or the poor man's divorce. A husband would leave a note on the table and disappear, joining the army of hobos riding the rails. He left not necessarily out of a lack of love, but out of a profound sense of failure, believing his family would be better off with one less mouth to feed. The simple pleasures that once held a family together were among the first casualties. A Sunday drive was impossible without money for gas. A trip to the cinema was an absurd luxury. Even buying a newspaper or an ice cream cone was out of the question. Life was stripped down to its bare essentials, the search for work and the struggle for food. There was little room left for joy. The home, once a place of consumption and rest, was transformed back into a center of production, much like it had been in the 19th century. Women baked their own bread because a bag of flour was cheaper than a store-bought loaf. They canned vegetables from their own small gardens if they were lucky enough to have one. They mended clothes instead of buying new ones. The home became a factory for survival. The constant strain of poverty, worry, and resentment was a potent extinguisher of romance. Physical and emotional intimacy often withered under the harsh conditions. It is difficult to feel affection for a spouse when you view them as a symbol of your own failure or as another burden to carry. For many couples, the marriage bed became just another cold, lonely place. And yet, it is a testament to human resilience that many families did, in fact, survive the Depression with their bonds intact. Some were held together by a grim sense of duty, others by a deep and abiding love that proved stronger than any economic force. They weathered the storm together, emerging on the other side scarred and weary, but still a family. But we end our chapter on the Depression-era family, a unit under a state of siege from within and without. The economic crisis was a slow-acting poison that attacked the most intimate parts of people's lives, testing their love, their patience, and their sanity. It was a long, dull, and arduous test of the vow till death do us part. Now let the quiet stillness of that strained and silent home guide you into a deep and untroubled sleep. As the nation sank deeper into the economic mire, a fundamental shift occurred in Washington. The era of rugged individualism and waiting for the market to fix itself came to an abrupt end with the election of Franklin D. Roosevelt. In its place came a whirlwind of government action, a bold, chaotic, and desperate experiment known as the New Deal. For the American worker, this meant the government was finally getting into the job creation business, albeit in its own uniquely bureaucratic way. The New Deal unleashed what became known as the alphabet soup, a dizzying array of new federal agencies known by their 3- and 4-letter acronyms: the PWA, the CWA, the TVA, and so on. It was a frantic attempt to throw everything at the wall and see what stuck. At the heart of this experiment were the massive public works programs, designed to put millions of unemployed Americans back to work. It was a radical idea for its time and a deeply mixed blessing for those it was designed to help. The core philosophy of these programs was simple. A job, even a temporary and low-paying one, was better for a person's soul than a simple handout, or what was dismissively called the dole. A work relief paycheck, however meager, restored a sense of dignity and purpose that had been systematically crushed by years of unemployment. The government was no longer just providing charity, it was providing a role to play. Perhaps Roosevelt's favorite of these new agencies was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC. This program was ingeniously designed to tackle two problems at once. It addressed the rampant unemployment among young single men, and it addressed the nation's deteriorating natural resources. The plan was to get these restless young men out of the desperate cities, where they might cause trouble, and put them to work in the great outdoors. Life in the CCC was a strange hybrid of a job and a military enlistment. The camps, usually set up in remote forests or national parks, were run by the U.S. Army. The young men, known as enrollees, slept in barracks, woke to a bugle call, wore uniforms, and were subject to military steel discipline. It was a structured, regimented life that was a shock to many, but it also guaranteed 3 square meals a day and a place to sleep, which was more than they had back home. These soil soldiers, as they were sometimes called, performed grueling but vital conservation work. They planted over 3 billion trees, earning the nickname Roosevelt's Tree Army. They fought forest fires, built dams to control erosion, carved out hiking trails, and developed the infrastructure for what would become many of America's most beloved national parks. They were literally reshaping the American landscape with their bare hands. The pay structure of the CCC was a lesson in forced responsibility. An enrollee earned $30.00 a month, which sounded like a decent sum at the time. However, the catch was that a mandatory $25.00 of that was sent directly home to their families. This provided crucial relief to their struggling parents and siblings. The worker himself was left with just $5.00 a month, about 17 cents a day, for his own personal expense. It was a state-enforced allowance for grown men. While the CCC was for young, single men, the largest of the New Deal employment agencies was the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. The WPA was a behemoth designed to provide a job for one unemployed head of household from any eligible family. At its peak, it was the largest single employer in the entire country, with millions of workers on its payroll. The physical legacy of the WPA is staggering and still visible all around America. Its workers built more than 600,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, 75,000 bridges, and 8,000 parks. They constructed schools, hospitals, post offices, and airports. If your town has a handsome stone and mortar civic building or a charming park with a rustic stone wall, there's a good chance it was built by the WPA. The wages for this work were carefully calculated. The WPA paid what was called a security wage, more than the pittance of a relief check, but deliberately less than what one could earn in the private sector. The idea was to not compete with private industry and to encourage workers to leave the WPA if a real job became available. In practice, it meant the pay was just enough to keep a family from starving, but rarely enough to get ahead. The work itself was often brutally physical. The tools of the WPA were the shovel, the pickaxe, and the wheelbarrow. Men would spend their days digging ditches, laying sewer lines, or paving roads by hand. The safety standards of the era were not what they are today, and construction work was inherently dangerous. For many, it was the hardest physical labor they had ever done in their lives. This led to the most persistent criticism of the WPA that much of the work was useless, make work, designed simply to keep idle hands busy. The term boondoggle was popularized specifically to describe these allegedly pointless projects. Critics in the press and in Congress delighted in finding examples of men leaning on their shovels or engaging in comical-sounding projects. The stories of WPA boondoggles became legendary. There were tales of workers being paid to rake leaves back and forth or to build roads that led to nowhere in particular. Research projects were a favorite target for ridicule, with critics mocking federally funded studies on the history of the safety pin or the geographic distribution of ancient proverbs. Perhaps the most fascinating and controversial branch of the WPA was Federal Project No. 1. This was an unprecedented effort to provide jobs for unemployed artists, writers, musicians, and actors. The idea that artists were also workers who deserved support was radical, and conservatives derided it as a frivolous waste of taxpayer money, a so-called artist's dole. And yet, the output of this project was extraordinary. The WPA fund painters created thousands of murals in post offices and public buildings, many of which are now considered national treasures. The Federal Theater Project staged plays for millions of Americans, many of whom had never seen a live performance before. The Federal Music Project sponsored free concerts and collected folk songs from across the country. The Federal Writers Project had a particularly lasting impact. It produced a series of state guidebooks that are still valued for their rich detail. More importantly, its writers were dispatched to collect oral histories from ordinary Americans. This included the now invaluable collection of interviews with the last living generation of formerly enslaved people, a historical record that would have otherwise been lost forever. Political criticism was constant. Opponents of Roosevelt claimed The WPA was little more than a giant political machine using its massive payroll to buy votes for the Democratic Party. The initials WPA were mockingly said to stand for We Piddle Around or Works Projects for Democrats. The charge of political patronage was not entirely without merit, but it ignored the very real work being done. From the perspective of the worker, however, all this political noise was secondary. Sure, you got a job, building a park in the middle of nowhere for peanuts, but hey, it beat starving and being bored. A WPA job was a routine. It was a reason to get out of bed in the morning. It was a paycheck, however small, that you had earned through your own labor. This restoration of dignity was perhaps the most important and least measurable achievement of the New Deal's work programs. The shame of the breadline was replaced by the pride of a hard day's work. The ability to come home tired and put food on the table, food that you had earned yourself, was a powerful psychological antidote to the despair of the Depression. These programs also had a profound impact on the social fabric of the nation. The parks, pools, schools, and libraries built by the WPA became the centers of community life. They were shared public spaces that brought people together and fostered a sense of civic pride. The country was not just being put back to work, it was being rebuilt, both physically and socially. It is important to note, however, that the New Deal was not a paradise of equality. Opportunities for women and African Americans in programs like the WPA and CCC were limited. They were often shunted into lower-paying jobs and worked in segregated units. The New Deal provided relief, but it did not dismantle the prevailing racial and gender hierarchies of the era. And it was always understood that these jobs were temporary. They were a stopgap, a patch on a broken system, not a permanent solution. The goal was always for the private economy to recover and absorb these workers back into real jobs. The work relief programs were a bridge intended to get the country from the depths of the Depression to the other side. That other side finally came into view not because of the New Deal, but because of the looming threat of another world war. As the nation began to mobilize for war in the late 1930s and early 1940s, the factories roared back to life. The great public works programs were gradually phased out, their purpose now fulfilled by the massive employment boom of military production. In the end, the New Deal's work programs remain a complex and controversial part of American history. They were criticized as inefficient, wasteful, and politically motivated. But for the millions of workers who were given a shovel instead of a handout, they were a lifeline. They were a mixed blessing, to be sure, but a blessing nonetheless. Now let the steady, monotonous rhythm of that pickaxe and shovel guide you into a deep and restful sleep. We have spent a great deal of time exploring the physical hardships of the Great Depression, the unemployment lines, the dust storms, the shanty towns, the gnawing hunger. But beneath all of these external struggles lay a deeper, more insidious crisis. This was the internal collapse, the invisible damage done to the minds and spirits of a generation. The Great Depression was not just an economic event, it was a profound psychological trauma. It wasn't just your wallet that was empty. Sometimes it was your soul. For all the talk of systemic failure and government policy, the average unemployed worker in the 1930s had a much simpler explanation for their predicament. It was their own fault. The deeply ingrained American ethos of the self-made man had a dark and terrible flip side, the self-blamed man. If success was a sign of your own hard work and virtue, then failure must be a sign of your own weakness, your own inadequacy, your own personal flaw. This immense, internalized shame was a heavy burden to carry. It was a poison that seeped into every corner of a person's life. The logical endpoint of this despair for a tragic number of people was the decision that life was no longer worth living. The suicide rate in the United States, which had been steadily declining, spiked dramatically after the crash of 1929. While the myth of stockbrokers leaping from windows was largely exaggerated, the quiet, desperate suicides of ordinary men who had lost everything were terrifyingly real. In the 1800s, 930s, the modern language of mental health did not exist in the public sphere. People didn't talk about clinical depression or anxiety disorders. Instead, they suffered from what they called their nerves, or a deep, unshakable case of the blues, or a constant state of worry. It was a vague, ill-defined but pervasive sense of dread that settled over the nation like a permanent, gloomy fog. There were no therapists to consult, no medications to prescribe. There was only the quiet, lonely struggle inside your own head. Perhaps the most profound psychological wound was the death of the American dream itself. For generations, the nation had been powered by a core belief that with hard work and determination, anyone could achieve success, and that your children would have a better life than you did. The Depression systematically dismantled that belief. It taught a brutal lesson that you could work hard your whole life and still lose everything. Hope for the future was replaced by a deep-seated fear of it. This fear of the future manifested as a kind of national paralysis. People stopped planning, they stopped dreaming. Young couples postponed marriage, and married couples postponed having children, not just for economic reasons, but because the future seemed too bleak to imagine bringing a new life into it. The horizon of possibility, once seen as bright and limitless, now appeared to be a dead end. This internal sense of shame and hopelessness led to a widespread social withdrawal. People became isolated, not because they were antisocial, but because they couldn't bear to face their friends and neighbors. Socializing, even in its simplest forms, became a source of anxiety. You couldn't afford to go out, and you were too ashamed to invite people into your meager home, so you just stayed home, and the world outside your window slowly faded away. The simple act of reciprocity, a cornerstone of community life, became impossible. If a neighbor brought over a small plate of food, you felt a sense of gratitude, immediately followed by a wave of shame because you knew you could not return the favor. This inability to participate in the basic give and take of social life caused many to simply cut themselves off, retreating into a self-imposed isolation. For the unemployed, there was the constant, exhausting effort of maintaining appearances. You would leave the house each morning in your best threadbare suit, pretending to look for work, just to keep the neighbors from knowing you had nowhere to go. You would avoid old friends on the street to dodge the inevitable well-meaning question, "Found anything yet?" It was a performance of normalcy that drained what little emotional energy you had left. The mind of an unemployed person was often a prison of monotonous, circular thoughts. The same worries would play on a loop day and night. How will we pay the rent? Where will the next meal come from? What will become of us? This constant, low-grade anxiety was exhausting. It made it difficult to sleep, difficult to think, and difficult to find even a moment's peace. And what do you do with the endless, empty hours of a day with no job? You find ways to pass the time that cost nothing. Men would take long, aimless walks ending up miles from home with no real destination. They would take up whittling, turning a piece of scrap wood into a pile of shavings with a kind of meditative focus. Or they would simply sit on a park bench or their own front steps and stare into space for hours, their minds both racing and completely vacant. One of the few sources of cheap escapism was the radio. For millions, the radio was a vital psychological lifeline. It brought the outside world into their isolated homes and provided a distraction from their own troubles. For a few hours each evening, a family could forget their worries and lose themselves in the adventures of the Lone Ranger or the comedy of Jack Benny. It was a brief, electronic anesthetic for a nation in pain. The generation that lived through this era was marked for life by a depression mentality. Even decades later, in times of unprecedented prosperity, many could not shake the deep-seated habits of extreme frugality and fear. They would hoard string and tin foil. They would have a lifelong terror of being in debt. They would distrust banks and the stock market. They had seen how quickly everything could be lost, and they never, ever forgot it. This deep-seated anxiety was passed down to their children. Kids who grew up in the Depression learned early on that the world was an insecure and frightening place. They absorbed their parents' constant worry. They learned to be quiet, to not ask for things, and to live with a persistent, low-level fear that the floor could drop out from under them at any moment. It was a childhood steeped in the anxieties of their elders. The reluctance to accept charity, even when it was desperately needed, was another symptom of this psychological crisis. Standing in a breadline was not just a quest for food. It was a public admission of defeat. For a proud man, this was the ultimate humiliation. Many would go hungry for days before they could bring themselves to accept what they saw as a handout, a final confirmation of their own personal failure. Men, in particular, suffered in silence. The cultural expectations of the era demanded that a man be strong, stoic, and self-reliant. There was no room for emotional vulnerability, so they kept their fears and their shame bottled up inside, where it festered into anger, depression, and a profound sense of alienation from their own families. Women, on the other hand, were often the designated emotional managers of the household. They bore the brunt of their husband's silent despair, while simultaneously dealing with their own anxieties about feeding their children and holding the home together. Their work was endless, and it was emotional as well as physical. They were the glue, often stretched to the breaking point, that kept the family from completely falling apart. For some, the crisis led to a questioning of their most fundamental beliefs. They had been taught to have faith in the institutions of their country, the banks, the government, the free market. When those institutions so catastrophically failed them, it created a crisis of faith. Some even began to question their religious faith, wondering how a benevolent God could allow such widespread and senseless suffering. While many people internalized their failure, the immense psychological pressure also led some to search for external enemies. This was a way to redirect the pain and anger. The blame was placed on bankers, on politicians, on immigrants, or on other minority groups. This search for scapegoats frayed the social fabric and fueled the ugliest political tensions of the era. And yet, even in the depths of this despair, people found small ways to cope. Tiny sparks of light in the overwhelming darkness, a shared, cynical joke with a neighbor, the small victory of a few vegetables grown in a tiny backyard garden, a free concert in the park put on by the WPA. These were not solutions, but they were momentary stays against the darkness, small affirmations of a shared humanity. We often speak of the resilient spirit of the generation that survived the Depression, and while there is truth in that, it is also a romantic simplification. For many, it wasn't a matter of heroic resilience, it was simply the absence of any other choice. You got up each morning because the alternative was to lie down and die. You endured not because you were strong, but because you had to. And so we end our journey through the internal landscape of the Great Depression. The banks eventually reopened, the factories started hiring again, and the economy, in time, recovered. But the psychological wounds, the invisible scars of shame, guilt, and lost hope, lasted a lifetime. It was a quiet, internal hum of anxiety that would echo in the minds of a generation until their dying day. Now, let that quiet hum guide you, gently, into a deep and peaceful sleep. In the midst of the relentless, soul-crushing grind of the Great Depression, a fundamental human need asserted itself with a vengeance, the need for a distraction. When your daily reality consists of unemployment lines, eviction notices, and a constant gnawing hunger, the desire to escape into a different world for a few hours becomes less a luxury and more a vital psychological necessity. And so a new economy of escapism emerged, offering cheap thrills for dark times. It was the nation's coping mechanism, a temporary anesthetic for a population in chronic pain. These new forms of entertainment were not designed to enlighten or to challenge. They were designed to distract, to soothe, and to offer a brief, blessed moment of forgetting. They were the mental equivalent of the watery soup served in the breadlines. Thin, not particularly nourishing, but just enough to keep you going for another day. This was not the culture of high society, this was the culture of mass survival, built on the simple principle that a person cannot live on bread alone, especially when they don't have much bread. The undisputed king of this escapist kingdom, the electronic hearth around which the nation gathered, was the radio. By the 1930s, radios were common fixtures in most American homes. They were a one-time purchase that provided a limitless supply of free entertainment. In an era where families could no longer afford to go out, the radio brought the world in. It filled the silent, worried evenings with stories, music, laughter, and a connection to a world beyond one's own misery. This was the golden age of radio. Families would crowd around their sets to listen to comedies like Amos and Andy or the Jack Benny program, sharing a rare and precious laugh. Housewives would follow the dramatic twists and turns of daytime soap operas, dramas whose convoluted problems made their own seem almost manageable by comparison. Children would hide under the covers with a flashlight, listening to the thrilling adventures of The Shadow or Little Orphan Annie. The radio also became a tool for direct political comfort. President Franklin D. Roosevelt masterfully used the medium for his fireside chats. Speaking in a calm, reassuring, fatherly tone, he would explain his New Deal policies directly to the American people. For millions, it felt as though the president himself was sitting in their living room, acknowledging their suffering and promising them that things would get better. It was a brilliant use of technology to create a sense of national intimacy and shared purpose. If the radio was the cheap, everyday escape, the movies were the grand weekly pilgrimage. A trip to the cinema was a truly immersive experience. For the price of a dime or a quarter, you could leave your dreary black and white world behind and enter a magnificent palace of velvet seats and golden curtains. On the screen was a world of shimmering, soundtracked fantasy. It was the ultimate distraction, a 2-hour dose of manufactured dreams. A movie ticket was certainly a luxury, but it was one that millions of Americans deemed essential for their mental health. To entice audiences, theaters offered promotions like Dish Night, where every ticket came with a free piece of dinnerware. Housewives would return week after week to collect a full set, a small, tangible prize in a life of constant loss. The movies weren't just selling a film, they were selling a brief, affordable vacation from reality. And what a vacation it was. The most popular films of the era were deliberately, gloriously unrealistic. The musicals of Busby Berkeley were a prime example. He created surreal, kaleidoscopic dance numbers featuring hundreds of beautiful women arranged in geometric patterns. The plots were flimsy, but that didn't matter. The point was the sheer, overwhelming spectacle. Nothing cures existential dread like a Busby Berkeley dance number. For a more elegant escape, audiences flocked to the films of Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers. They would glide across impossibly glamorous Art Deco sets, dressed in tuxedos and flowing gowns, falling in love without a single worry about rent or breadlines. Their world was one of wit, grace, and effortless romance. A perfect fantasy for people whose lives were clumsy, drab, and difficult. Another popular genre offered a different kind of fantasy, the gangster film. In movies like The Public Enemy, actors like James Cagney played charismatic, tough-talking criminals who defied a corrupt system. For audiences who felt betrayed and powerless, there was a vicarious thrill in watching someone take what they wanted and live by their own rules, even if they were ultimately gunned down in the final reel. And then there were the deeply optimistic, feel-good comedies, particularly those of director Frank Capra. In films like Mr. Deeds Goes to Town or You Can't Take It With You, he celebrated the decency and wisdom of the common man, showing that kindness and community could triumph over greed and cynicism. These films were a powerful dose of reassurance, a cinematic promise that American values would ultimately prevail. For those who couldn't afford a movie ticket, entertainment could be found right on the kitchen table. The 1930s saw a boom in the popularity of board games, a cheap and engaging way for a family to spend an evening together, distracting themselves from their collective worries. The most iconic of these was a new game called Monopoly. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. In a time when millions were losing their homes and had no money, here was a game that allowed you to experience the thrill of buying property, building hotels, and driving your opponents into bankruptcy. It was a fantasy of wealth and power that was the complete opposite of the players' real lives. Another popular new game was Scrabble. It offered a different kind of escape, a retreat into the orderly intellectual world of words. In a life that felt chaotic and senseless, the simple act of forming words on a board was a way to create a small pocket of order and meaning. It was a quiet, cerebral distraction from the loud, irrational world outside. With no money to buy new books, Americans flocked to their public libraries in record numbers. Library circulation soared as people sought free reading material to fill the empty hours. They devoured novels, biographies, and history books, anything to occupy their minds. Reading was a silent, personal escape, a journey you could take while sitting in a worn-out armchair. For those seeking a more thrilling, lowbrow read, this was also the golden age of the pulp magazine. For a dime, you could buy a magazine printed on cheap, rough paper, filled with sensational stories of hard-boiled detectives, spacefaring adventurers, or terrifying horrors. This was also the dawn of the comic book, with characters like Superman making his debut in 1938, offering a fantasy of a powerful hero who could solve problems that seemed insurmountable. One of the most bizarre and grimly fascinating forms of entertainment was the dance marathon. These were grueling endurance contests where couples would have to remain on their feet dancing for hundreds and sometimes thousands of consecutive hours. The last couple standing would win a cash prize. It was a spectacle of human exhaustion, a desperate and painful competition for survival. The dance marathons became a dark metaphor for the era itself. People would pay a small admission fee to sit and watch the contestants slowly break down, both physically and mentally. It was suffering packaged as entertainment, a public display of the desperate lengths people would go to for a little bit of money. The audience watched, perhaps seeing a reflection of their own long, exhausting struggle. But not all entertainment was so grim. The simple, free pleasures of community life became more important than ever. People gathered for church socials and potluck dinners, where each family would bring what little they had to share. Community sings brought people together to raise their voices in song, a way to build solidarity and momentarily forget their troubles. The WPA's federal music and theater projects also brought free, high-quality culture to the masses. A person could see a classic play or hear a symphony orchestra in their local park, performances that would have been completely inaccessible to them before. It was a democratic distribution of art, a recognition that beauty and culture were not just for the rich. Sports also remained a popular and vital distraction. Baseball was the national pastime, and heroes like Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig were figures of mythic stature. Boxing was also immensely popular, particularly the career of heavyweight champion Joe Louis, whose victories became a source of immense pride, especially for the African-American community. Sports provided clear narratives of struggle and triumph, something sorely lacking in daily life. And perhaps the most common form of entertainment was the simplest of all, visiting. With no money to go out, people rediscovered the art of sitting on a neighbor's front porch. They would talk, share stories, play cards, and just enjoy a moment of human connection. It cost nothing, and in a time of profound isolation, it was a vital way to reaffirm social bonds. Ultimately, all these forms of entertainment served the same purpose. They were a temporary balm on a deep wound. They didn't fix the economy, find anyone a job, or put food on the table, but they provided a crucial psychological service. They offered a moment of laughter, a thrill of adventure, or a dream of a better world. They were the cheap thrills that kept a nation's spirit from being completely extinguished. They were the faint light of a movie projector in a dark room, the crackling voice from a radio in a silent house. They were the small, necessary fantasies that gave people just enough strength to wake up and face another long, dull, and difficult day. Now, let the faint, flickering memory of those old films and radio shows guide you into a quiet and restful sleep. And so we arrive at the end of our long, dreary journey through the decade of despair. We have stood in the breadlines, ridden the rails, choked on the dust of a dying prairie, and sheltered in cardboard castles. We have seen a nation brought to its knees and a generation of workers subjected to a relentless series of trials that tested the very limits of their endurance. It was, to put it mildly, an ordeal, a masterclass in misery that reshaped the soul of a nation. Let us be clear, as we dim the lights on this chapter of history, it truly, profoundly sucked to be a worker during the Great Depression. There is no romantic silver lining to the hunger, no charming quaintness in the poverty. It was a decade of loss, the loss of jobs, of homes, of security, of dignity, and for many, the loss of hope itself. It was a systematic dismantling of the certainties that had defined American life, leaving millions adrift in a sea of anxiety. But out of this crucible of suffering, a certain kind of wisdom was forged, a hard one, deeply cynical and eminently practical wisdom. The first and most enduring lesson was in the sacred art of frugality. The Depression taught an entire generation how to stretch a nickel until it screamed for mercy. They learned that a tea bag could be used 3 times, that a worn-out shirt could become a dozen cleaning rags, and that a piece of string was a valuable resource to be saved at all costs. This was not the cheerful, lifestyle choice frugality of a modern influencer. This was the grim, compulsory thrift of survival. It became a permanent part of their psyche, a depression mentality that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Even decades later, in times of great prosperity, they would be the ones washing out plastic bags and saving rubber bands, unable to shake the deep-seated fear that everything could disappear again in an instant. The second lesson learned in the abyss was the vital importance of a dark sense of humor. When you have lost everything, laughter becomes one of the last available forms of defiance. The jokes about Hoover blankets and Hoovervilles were not just jokes, they were a way of naming their pain, of staring it in the face and refusing to be utterly broken by it. It was the gallows humor of people with nothing left to lose, a necessary psychological defense against complete despair. The Depression also forced a fundamental reevaluation of what it meant to be wealthy. The fantasy of stock market riches had evaporated overnight. In its place, a new, more tangible definition of wealth emerged. To be rich in the 1930s was to have a steady job, any job. It was to have a pantry with food in it, a roof that didn't leak, and the ability to pay the doctor when your child got sick. The abstract dream of millions was replaced by the concrete reality of simple, blessed security. But this wisdom was not without its scars. The relentless anxiety, the shame of unemployment, the fear of the future, these experiences left a permanent mark. The generation that endured the Depression became, in many ways, a generation that was afraid to dream too big ever again. They taught their children the importance of saving, of caution, and of finding a safe, steady job. The hard-won wisdom of scarcity was also a legacy of fear. So as we conclude our history and as you begin to drift toward sleep, take a moment to reflect on the silent struggles of those who came before. Think of the quiet desperation of a father unable to feed his family, the gnawing anxiety of a mother trying to make a meal out of nothing, the lost childhood of a boy sent to work in a mine. Their reality was a world where a loaf of bread was a luxury and a secure future was an almost unimaginable fantasy. May your own pantry be full, your cupboards well stocked. May your anxieties be small and your bed be warm. May your job security, that fragile concept they dreamed of, be mercifully, unequivocally, non-negotiable. And may the only lines you have to stand in be for something enjoyable, a fleeting inconvenience rather than a daily ritual of survival. Thank you for joining us on this tour of delightfully dreadful times. We hope these tales of historical hardship have provided a strange sort of comfort, a dull and monotonous backdrop to guide you into slumber. The story of the Great Depression is a stark reminder of how fragile our systems can be, and of the quiet, often forgotten resilience of ordinary people in the face of ordinary hardship. May the worries of that long-ago decade fade into the background. Let the silence of the breadlines and the empty hum of the factories become a gentle white noise. May your dreams be filled with surplus and solid investments, and may you awaken with a renewed appreciation for the simple, boring, and beautiful security of your own time. Good night.